Typically, when you're starting something, if you don't have a clear plan, especially if you're sculpting organic stuff, a lot of times it's easy to go right into Dynamesh. So when you first create an object in Zbrush, like if I create, so the point of this kind of mini lecture is that I want to kind of create, let's say like a tombstone, just a simple square one, right? And right now this thing is okay. It's got enough polygons throughout and it's pretty even in its polygon distribution, right? But let's say sometimes you import a mesh or you make a mesh and it's got a lot of polys kind of in one direction and not very many in another. Well, if you try to sculpt this, let's say I make this a poly mesh, I've got a ton of vertices here and not a lot here and maybe a lot in here because of these crosses. But again, not a lot in between, right? So the problem is that, you know, sometimes you don't plan for enough mesh. And even if I divide this, it's still going to be a bit of a problem, right? So let me just, maybe I'll go back to the cube and just show a different sort of variation on this. So sometimes you could have very few height divisions, right? Or maybe you have a lot of height divisions, but very few vertical, right? So it's just a straight line down, a straight polygon down. So again, if you divide this once or twice, right, there's going to be a lot more mesh up here and a lot less down here. So that's often a problem that can come up is if you're kind of building a really basic shape, whether you do it in Maya or ZBrush, it doesn't always give you, you know, if you don't plan right or if you're not maybe thinking and you just put something out and start sculpting it, it doesn't divide well. Divided mesh like this can be a little bit more organized or a little bit neater in a way, right? So if I divide this, you know, it can be a little bit neater, but again, the problem is that sometimes the mesh is more dense in one spot versus another, okay? So Dynamesh is great. We can get away from divisions and just focus straight on a Dynamesh, okay? And that just evenly cuts through. So if I undo and redo this at very, very low resolution, it's actually literally cutting through the mesh from 6 sides with like a grid. And then sometimes you get, you know, these triangles and stuff, but it does kind of make the distribution even. So that's one huge advantage. So it's really great for kind of conceptual sort of modeling or doing damage modeling and stuff like that. Oftentimes, when I get towards something that's more close to a final shape, I slowly Dynamesh from a low resolution and slowly build the resolution up higher and higher. So let's say if I have this cube again, right, I'm going to squash it down. So remember, even when you do scaling, right, now all these polys get packed in here, but they're still spread out here. So it's an uneven distribution. I'm going to scale it up here, maybe scale it a bit wider. So again, if I were to just divide the mesh, make poly mesh first to make it editable and just divide it a bunch, it would still be a problem, right? Things would be more detailed on the sides, but more blocky looking on the front and back because there's the mesh is more spread out there. So that's why, like I said, it's useful to Dynamesh, right? I'll say, no, I don't want to save my subdivision levels. And it gives me a nice even spread of mesh, okay? So that brings me up to 100,000. And like I said, I would sculpt a bit maybe, hit shift to soften. Okay. So that allows me to sculpt. One other thing I'll mention, just as a bit of a side note, so let's say you want to sculpt on something that's kind of soft or kind of round, and you bring in something low poly from Maya. So let's say it's a sphere kind of like this, and you have less sides. So it's very, very kind of segmented. When you see a mesh that looks very blocky and low poly, that's basically called a segmented mesh. So the problem is, like, I can Dynamesh this, right? If I Dynamesh it, it looks still the same. So I'd have to actually go in and smooth a whole bunch to try to get it round, right? Because it's literally just taking whatever object is there and like putting this mesh cutting mechanism through it. So sometimes what I'll do before this, I'll undo. I might actually divide it with smoothing on a few times until it gets nice and smooth looking and then Dynamesh. Again, if it asks you to freeze subdivision levels, in this situation, I almost always say no. I will explain freezing at some other point, but for now, when you're starting out, I find this is just a very good way to work, okay? So I will Dynamesh and re-Dynamesh. So anytime you pull out something new or you're maybe wanting to go to, basically the smaller the detail, the higher the Polycount has to be. So I would up the resolution gradually, and I try to restrict myself as a good rule. I try to restrict myself to lower polys at the beginning. So low poly count, big shapes, right? Big, broad shapes. And as I go higher in poly count, I can get smaller and smaller in the detail scale. So sometimes I'll kind of make a new version of that mesh using Zbrush. So then it does give you a clean model that you can send to Maya, that you can unwrap, that you can animate potentially. So that's usually a final step. And if I ever have to go backwards, so let's say there's a major change in the model, like, oh, my character needs 2 more arms now. I would, at a really high resolution, Dynamesh it, attach the arms, Dynamesh it, because Dynameshing can merge parts together, and then just Zbrush it to make the clean low res again. Or maybe just tweak the version I had and, you know, slap on a copy of the arms in roughly the same position. And the great thing is, like, from Dynamesh to a clean, organized mesh via Zbrush, you can transfer those details. So a lot of times that's done through what's called Project All. So that's really the main overview, I would say, of how sculpting is done in Zbrush. There might be a few exceptions. So if you're building really mechanical, man-made, human-made stuff, a lot of times it's good to keep clean, organized, low-res polys. But we'll see examples where we can totally actually break that rule and just kind of start Dynameshing right away. So yeah, back in Zbrush. So if I take this cube, just your standard cube, yeah. So yeah, if you want to kind of get an object that is non-polar, meaning things don't pinch to a top point and a bottom point with triangles, you kind of have to do this little trick in Zbrush where you switch to the Polymesh 3D star, and then down below in this area called Initialize, you can click on Q cube, which is a 444, right? Nice even grid. And this is called a non-polar cube, or you can do a non-polar sphere. And again, if you change the resolution, let's say I do 666, right? You see it actually makes a non-polar sphere. So this smooths better, it unwraps better, right? Because you can actually unwrap it almost like a box, right? Because technically, if I do this, this is almost like, you know, the top plane, bottom plane of the cube, and then there's the sides. And you can actually see the original polygroups from the original 2x2x2 cube, right? So this can be very useful. But anyways, going back to this, let's say I just do a 6x6x6 cube. And you can change these, right? You just change it to 2x2x2 and say Q cube. That basically means quad cube, quad sphere, or a grid, like a quad grid. So what I often like to do before I get into the move tool and scaling, I'm going to just hit X to make sure my symmetry's on. I like to sort of see that I'm facing the front of the object, and you can also turn on the floor to make sure you know what the bottom of the object is. So I'm just going to make like a very quick, basic kind of tombstone. Right, so I'll scale this thing up, scale it wider, give it kind of the right proportions. Right, that feels about right. I'll turn on perspective as well. So like I said, this thing is actually somewhat of an even grid. It's a little bit narrower on the sides. But if you want to get into sculpting with nice even mesh throughout, you can pretty much just click on Dynamesh right away. And sorry, I'm going to restore my standard interface just so you guys can follow along for now. All right, so this gives you nice even mesh throughout. It's not super high res. It's about 20,000 polys, but it's pretty good for now. The main trick to actually get this mesh damaged is very simple. It's one brush. So whenever you want to do damage on anything, you bring it in. You can Dynamesh it maybe at a start, and then you go to B for brush, T for trim, and there's 2 of them, trim adaptive and trim dynamic. I find dynamic by far the better of the 2 brushes. So I'm going to select trim dynamic. And it's really as simple as this. Just brush across the edges. Oops. Let's make sure my thing is a poly mesh, because I don't think I actually made it a poly mesh yet. And I would turn off symmetry because you don't want exact symmetrical damage. And if you run across the edge, I usually kind of hack away at it, kind of break it down a bit, you know. So you can even kind of break off a corner this way, and it makes it kind of like look nice and chipped, right? So that's such a simple technique. I find it one of the kind of essentials to kind of creating, you know, either stylized damaged objects or anything that has kind of like chips and dents and damage. You know, it's such a great tool, and you can get such good results really, really quickly, right? So just come across it like this. And so you can get this really, really cool look. And kind of the more erratic, the better, you know? So right away, it starts to get this kind of really kind of interesting and believable look, right? Now my poly count is still pretty low. So I would usually kind of go through and sort of chip away at a lot of stuff. You know, you can also smooth out some edges too and then sort of chip away at that just to make it look like it's a bit more worn, right? So that's kind of like step one. Again, I'm working on big shapes, big sort of pieces and chunks. And then again, this Dynamesh is actually still pretty low. It's, even though it's 20,000 polys by ZBrush standards, it's still pretty low. And you can sort of see, right, the little individual kind of polygons and vertices there. So I would up the resolution a bit to go to the next step. Control, click, and drag. Oops, sorry, make sure Dynamesh is on.
Control, click, and drag just adds to the polycount.
Yeah, so basically if, so when Dynamesh is on, if you grab a move or let's say a snake hook brush, if you pull out, right, it'll stretch out. But when you control, click, and drag, it gives you that mesh more evenly distributed. Or if you're simply trying to up the resolution, you up the resolution, control, click, and drag. Now I do have to make a change to the surface before it recognizes that and then adds more mesh. But now I just went from like 50 to 95,000 polys, right? So next step I might do is to sort of say, I want an even texture throughout the surface, right? So I want to go in and go to surface, click on noise, and that opens up this thing that is the noise editor. So it literally adds like a mathematical pattern of kind of unevenness. So I want to give this thing like an old kind of rocky texture. And the two main sliders when I start out are basically the scale and then the strength slider. So you can make it look, you know, a little bit more textured and granite-like. And you have to hit OK, right? Once you hit OK, this is technically just like a material preview. It's not changing the surface. You have to either click on Apply to Mesh or Mask by Noise. Usually I do Apply to Mesh, and you see it actually now changes that surface, right? So very quickly we can kind of build up with a couple of simple moves. You know, some scaling on a box, we Dynamesh it, we trim dynamic the edges to damage it a bit, and then we can put a rough and rocky texture. And you can keep applying new noise options. I'll show you a little bit later how to apply directly cracks, dents, chips using alphas and images. So if I go to noise, sometimes I'll use this other thing called the noise light box. So it's actually got presets. And one of them is really cool. This one, like noise 15 is really good, or noise 05. So let's say I'll start with these kind of weird little chips and erosions. When you double click on that, it brings up that as, again, a material preview. It's not applied to the mesh yet, but if I go to edit, I can adjust, again, the noise scale, so I can make it really large. So it's just like a couple big chunks taken out. I'll leave the strength, and I'll say OK. And then I'll try apply to mesh. Now, sometimes you can see it actually kind of bulged the mesh out. Sometimes it does have a bit of a negative effect. So if you just go into edit and maybe take the strength down just a touch, right, it can be a little bit better result. Apply to mesh, and there we go.
Where did you find those alphas?
So when you're in the surface tool, it's under Lightbox Noisemaker. Now, the other thing I mentioned earlier, sometimes I'll do mask by noise. So what does that mean? Well, if I undo and go to mask by noise, it literally will leave behind a masked area to protect the larger portion of the model and an unmasked area. So now I can go in with either, you know, a standard brush, a clay brush maybe. I use clay brushes a lot. So I'll go to standard. And now you can actually brush that damage in. It may not seem like it's super detailed, but if you hold Alt and we kind of draw in, now you can control the depth and degree to which that damage is applied. It's pretty cool, right? And then you just clear the mask. Now, one thing I will mention, there are two limitations to the detail of this. As you can see, this sort of looks pixelated, right? It's one of two reasons. So if you ever see something and the damage looks pixelated, it could be because if you're using an image, the image is too low res. In this case, we're using a noise, and it just doesn't have enough polygons to display in real depth or detail how that texture should really look. So I'm going to clear the mask. I'm going to go to geometry, and I want to divide this up. My rule of thumb usually is that if you want anything with at least a minimal acceptable degree of detail without those polygons kind of showing up, I usually like to get to 1,000,000 polys or more on my object. So I'm going to try to Dynamesh this. I'm going to undo and just slowly up my resolution from like 100 to 200 to 500 to maybe 800. Yeah, so I'm going to up the resolution a bit higher to 1500, and I'm looking at the active points. I want to see that get to roughly about 1 million. Now, if it goes over, that's fine. 2 million is not too bad. And I'll go back. So I'm basically, you know, once you hit the limit of what the resolution can support in terms of detail, you have to go up in resolution, right? So that's kind of the idea, I think, behind this is go back to noise. It applies it. I could say apply to mesh. And it's going to look a lot more detailed, right? So it's not as limited. It looks so much more realistic, right? In a typical workflow, when you want to get this out of ZBrush, what I would do is actually duplicate the model. All right, so you have your original Dynamesh copy, and then on the new version, go to Geometry, turn off Dynamesh, and then we can sort of quickly Z-remesh this. Now, if I turn off my line option here on Polyframe, you can see, remember, because this was, I think, a Q cube, so it's got like 3 polygroups, the front and the back, the top and the bottom, and the left and the right. I think the left and the right look identical. Technically, though, they're a different group. So what I can do now, sometimes I'll temporarily Dynamesh my copy. So remember, this is a copy. I'm going to just Dynamesh it really, really low. So then when I Z-remesh, I'm going to make a super, super low poly version of this. I'm going to say keep groups. So the groups will sort of tell it, give this thing 6 sides. Z-remesh it. So we'll let that process. It takes a while, but. So if you take a look at this, I'll turn the wireframe back on, right? So it's got, you know, some polys. It's not the best looking shape, but I'll say keep it the same poly count of like 500-600 polys. Z-remesh it, right? It's a hell of a lot better. Now, what's cool about this is that technically I've got, remember, the old one and the new one. One sitting on top of the other. I'm going to solo this. So there's the solo button. I often do this a lot. Solo my object. And you can copy through a system called projection. So it projects one shape onto the other. So this is my new clean mesh, right? If I go to geometry and divide it once, maybe divide it twice, maybe 3 times, 4 times, so I can get that detail back at high res. Watch this. Remember, the old one's sitting there, which has all that crazy detail. I go project all. It'll take a second to project. And you know what? It gets pretty close. It's under the subtool palette.
But you have to have the low res one selected.
Yeah. So you got to be in your new low res. So this is like a miniature scaled down version of what you typically do for your short films, for a game or TV project, right? So I'm just projecting. I can go up, project, and I'm literally just bringing all that work that I did on the other Dynamesh into a new organized model that I can export at low resolution, right? So it's pretty amazing. It's a really ingenious system. So like I said, oftentimes I don't worry about the topology so much in the beginning unless it's really like technical and high level kind of hard surface object. If it's something that can be treated more organically like this or a character sculpt, then I would typically just Dynamesh all the way and Z-remesh at the end. So I've literally captured pretty much all the detail. And so you might wonder, well, what do we do with this, right? If you take this object, you can literally use the polygroups, right, to unwrap. So I can go polygroups, unwrap. Actually, I should be at my lowest division. It's sort of telling me, hey, go down in resolution. So you got to go to your lowest division, unwrap. And it's basically done. It's going to split each group off. And what's cool about this is you can go in and make things like a normal map or a texture map from that, right? So I can go create normal map. There you go. And then you can just send it out to Maya. So we catch all the high-res detail, but get a really good, simple, very light and fast to animate and render low res.